When Margaret Elaine Fowler woke up on the morning of September 14th, she had been married for 43 years, 3 months, and 11 days. By the afternoon of that same day, she had been married for none of those things. The joint checking account they had built together over 4 decades. The account that held the money from the sale of their first house. The money she had saved during the years she worked double shifts at the hospital laundry. The money that was supposed to carry them both through the end of their lives was empty, and her husband Gerald was in a car heading south on Route 9, with her best friend Carol sitting in the passenger seat. Margaret was 74 years old. She lived in Hardin Falls, a small town in western Tennessee, where the population had never exceeded 4,000, and where the same families had been occupying the same streets for 3 and 4 generations. A town where the woman at the hardware store knew your name before you said it, where the pastor at the Methodist church could tell you which pew your grandmother had preferred, where news did not travel through phones or screens but through the particular and efficient channel of 2 women talking outside the post office on a Tuesday morning. Everyone in Hardin Falls would know by Wednesday. Margaret understood this with the specific resignation of a woman who had lived in a small town her entire life and had no illusions about how information moved through it. She did not think about that on the afternoon of September 14th. She sat in the kitchen of the house on Clover Street, the house that was in Gerald's name alone, a detail he had arranged in 1987 that she had not thought to question because they were married, and in her understanding of the word married meant that what was his was hers, and what was hers was his, and she held the phone in her hands and looked at the bank balance on the screen. The balance was $0. The transfer had been completed at 7:43 that morning while she was still asleep. She sat with that number for a long time. Then she made herself a cup of tea, the way she had made herself tea every afternoon for 40 years, and she drank it at the kitchen table, and she looked out the window at the backyard she had tended for 31 years, the garden along the back fence that she had planted the spring after they moved in, the rose bushes she had propagated herself from cuttings, the old oak in the corner that had been there long before they arrived and would be there long after everything else was gone. She looked at all of it, and she felt something she did not immediately have a word for. It was not grief, exactly. It was more like the feeling of a floor giving way, the particular vertigo of understanding that what you had been standing on for your entire adult life was not as solid as you had believed. If you have ever had a number on a screen take the ground out from under you, if you have ever trusted someone for so long that the betrayal arrived not as a shock, but as a slow and terrible clarification of things that had always been true and that you had chosen not to see. If you believe that the things we are forced to find are always more important than the things we were handed, then stay with us. Because what Margaret Fowler found buried in that backyard did not just change her circumstances. It changed everything she had been told about the life she was living. This is her story. Margaret had met Gerald Fowler at a church social in the summer of 1979. She was 31 years old and had begun to make a private peace with the possibility that she might not marry, not from sadness about it, but from the practical assessment of a woman who had been self-sufficient since she was 19 and had come to find her own company adequate. She had a job she was good at, working in the administrative office of the Hardin Falls Community Hospital, a small house she rented with a friend named Dolores, and a garden she kept in the backyard that produced more tomatoes every summer than she could reasonably consume. Gerald was 34 and worked for the county assessor's office. He was not a dramatic man. He did not make large promises or sweeping declarations. He was steady and reliable in the way that certain men are steady and reliable. And Margaret, who had watched her own father's unreliability define the texture of her childhood, understood steadiness as the most valuable quality a person could possess. He brought her tomatoes from her own garden on their third date, because she had mentioned the surplus, and he had remembered. She had thought about that for a long time afterward. The remembering. The fact that he had listened and then acted on what he heard. They married in October of 1980 in the Methodist Church, where his family had been members for 2 generations. It was a small ceremony. Margaret wore a dress she had made herself from a pattern she bought at the fabric store on Main Street. She had altered it 3 times before she was satisfied. Her mother had driven up from Nashville and cried through most of the ceremony, which Margaret had expected. Dolores stood beside her as maid of honor. Carol was there too. Carol Brinson, who had been Margaret's closest friend since they were girls in the same 3rd grade classroom, who had sat in the 3rd pew from the front and caught Margaret's eye during the vows and smiled the particular smile of a woman who is genuinely happy for someone she loves. That had been 43 years ago. In the years that followed, Margaret and Gerald built the life that 2 careful, modest people build when they work steadily and spend less than they earn and do not expect more from the world than the world can reasonably deliver. They did not have children. This was not a choice they made so much as a circumstance that arrived and settled, and eventually became part of the shape of their life together. Margaret had grieved it privately in the early years, in the way you grieve things you cannot change, and had then directed the energy of that grief into the things she could build. The garden, the relationships, the work she took increasing pride in as the years passed and her responsibilities at the hospital grew. Gerald moved from the assessor's office to the county planning department and eventually to a position as deputy director of public works, a title that carried more authority than compensation, but that he wore with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has found his correct level in the world. He was not ambitious beyond his abilities, and he knew this about himself, which Margaret had always considered a form of wisdom. He came home at 5:30 most evenings. He mowed the lawn on Saturday mornings. He watched football in the fall and baseball in the summer, and complained about both with the consistency of a man for whom complaining about sports was a form of leisure rather than genuine dissatisfaction. He was not, in the way that matters for this story, a man who seemed capable of what he did. Carol Brinson had married a man named Robert in 1984 and divorced him in 1997, and had lived alone since in a house on the other side of Hardin Falls, working as the office manager at the dental practice on Elm Street. She and Margaret had lunch together every other Tuesday at the diner on Main Street. They had been doing this for so long that their booth, the one by the window that looked out on the parking lot, was understood by the staff to be theirs between 12 and 1:30 on alternating Tuesdays without anyone needing to be told. Carol had a particular laugh, loud and unself-conscious, the laugh of someone who had long ago stopped worrying about what people thought of her volume. Margaret had always loved that laugh. She had heard it at her own kitchen table hundreds of times over the decades. She would not hear it again. The money in the joint account had accumulated over 31 years of combined effort. Not quickly, not dramatically, in the way that money accumulates when 2 people who lived through the lean years of their youth develop a specific and lasting relationship with saving. Gerald had contributed from his county salary. Margaret had contributed from her hospital work which she had continued part-time after she officially retired at 65, because the work kept her useful and the income went directly into savings. They had sold their first house, the smaller one on Pine Street, where they had lived for the first 14 years of their marriage, and had deposited the proceeds. They had inherited a modest amount when Gerald's mother died in 2009 and had added it to the account without discussion, because what else would they do with it? The total, by the morning of September 14th, had been $203,000. This was not a fortune. It was the careful accumulation of two people who had worked hard and spent modestly, and expected that the money would see them through the end of their lives without becoming a burden to anyone. $203,000 transferred at 7:43 in the morning while Margaret slept. She called the bank at 2 in the afternoon. The woman she spoke to was apologetic in the careful way of someone following a protocol designed to manage these calls without making promises. The transfer had been authorized. Both account holders had signing authority. There was nothing irregular about the transaction from the bank's perspective. What Margaret could do, the woman said, was file a report. She could consult an attorney. There were steps. The woman gave her a number to call. Margaret wrote it down on the notepad she kept by the phone, the one with the small yellow flowers on the cover that she had bought at the pharmacy 3 years ago and had been using since. She looked at the number for a moment. Then she looked out the window at the garden. Gerald had left a note on the kitchen counter. She had seen it when she came downstairs that morning, but had set it aside because she had assumed it was a grocery list or a reminder about the hardware store. She read it now. It was 8 sentences long. He said he was sorry. He said he had not been happy for a long time. He said he and Carol had feelings for each other that had developed gradually, and that he had not intended but could not stop. He said he hoped Margaret would understand in time. He said the account was his right as a joint holder. He said the house would need to be discussed through lawyers. He said he wished her well. He said he was truly sorry. 8 sentences for 43 years. Margaret folded the note and put it in the kitchen drawer under the instruction manuals for appliances she no longer owned and the takeout menus from restaurants that had closed. She did not read it again. By Wednesday morning, everyone in Hardin Falls knew. This was not because anyone was cruel, though some were, but because a town of 4,000 people that has been the same 4,000 people for 3 generations does not have the infrastructure to contain information of this magnitude. People talked because they were worried, because they had known Margaret and Gerald for decades, and the story did not fit either of them, and the not fitting required discussion. Because Carol Brinson's loud laugh had filled many of the same rooms as their own laughter, and the betrayal of it was the kind of thing that required processing out loud. The processing happened at the hardware store, and the diner, and the post office, and the parking lot of the Methodist Church on Sunday morning. People processed with the best intentions and the worst possible timing, which is how most processing happens in small towns. Margaret's neighbor, a woman named Ruth Paxton, who was 79 and had lived next door since the Fowlers moved in, knocked on the back door on Wednesday morning with a casserole and a face that contained more information than Margaret needed at that moment. Ruth was a kind woman. She did not say anything unnecessary. She put the casserole in the refrigerator and sat at the kitchen table and drank tea with Margaret for 45 minutes and only said, when she left, that Margaret should call if she needed anything, and that the offer was genuine. Margaret believed her. Ruth was one of the few people in Hardin Falls whose offers were always genuine. The attorney's name was Patricia Oakes. She had an office above the insurance company on Main Street and had handled half the estates and divorces in Hardin Falls for 30 years. Margaret called her on Thursday. Patricia said the same things the bank had said, with more specificity and less protocol. Gerald had legal authority to transfer the joint funds. The fact that he had done so the morning of his departure, without discussion, would be relevant in divorce proceedings. The house, which was in Gerald's name alone, was Gerald's legal property, but a court would consider the length of the marriage and Margaret's contributions to the household in assessing her rights. There were options. The process would take time. Time, Margaret understood, was what she had most of and least of simultaneously. She was 74 years old. She was in good health, had always been in good health. But she understood the arithmetic of 74 in a way she had not needed to understand it the week before. The process Patricia described would take months, possibly longer. In the meantime, Margaret had $340 in a personal account she had maintained for small personal expenses, the house she was living in but did not own, and no income. She looked at the situation the way she had always looked at difficult situations, by identifying what she knew for certain and what she did not know yet, and what could be done about the things she did not know yet. It was the approach she had developed working in hospital administration, where the situations that arrived at your desk were never simple, and the people they involved were never at their best, and the only useful thing you could do was work through them systematically. She made a list. The list had 6 items on it. 3 of them she could address immediately. She started with those. Margaret had been working in the garden the morning she found it, 3 weeks after Gerald left. Not because the garden needed attention. It was late September, and the growing season was mostly finished. But because the garden was the place she went when she needed to move her body, while her mind worked through something, and there was a great deal for her mind to work through. She had been clearing the bed along the back fence where the tomatoes had been, pulling the dead plants and turning the soil for winter, when the trowel struck something that was not soil and not stone. The sound was different, a dull, resistant sound, the sound of metal. She cleared the soil around it with her hands, carefully, the way you move when you are not certain what you are uncovering. It took 10 minutes to expose enough of it to understand what she was looking at. A metal box, rectangular, approximately the size of a large shoebox. Dark with age and soil, but intact. The lid sealed with a simple clasp that had rusted closed. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. The house on Clover Street had been built in 1923 by a man named Howard Delacroix, a fact Margaret knew because Gerald had mentioned it when they were considering the purchase in 1992, and because the history of old houses was the kind of information that stayed with you in a small town where houses had histories. Howard Delacroix had lived in the house until 1961 and had died there at the age of 83. The house had passed through 2 other owners before the Fowlers. Margaret had met the woman who sold it to them, an elderly widow named Dorothy Sims, who had mentioned in passing during the walkthrough that the previous owner before her had been a particular man who kept to himself. She carried the box to the back porch. She found a flathead screwdriver in the drawer by the kitchen door and worked at the clasp for 20 minutes. The rust resisted and then gave way with a particular sound of something that has been sealed for a very long time, opening for the first time. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them from the soil moisture, were documents. Margaret unfolded them at the kitchen table, smoothing the creases carefully. The way you handle things you do not yet understand but sense are important. They were property deeds, 4 of them, all executed in the name of Howard James Delacroix. all pertaining to parcels of land in Hardin County and the adjacent Millbrook County. The dates ranged from 1931 to 1948. There was also a letter, handwritten on stationery that had yellowed at the edges but remained entirely legible, dated March 1959, 2 years before Howard Delacroix died. He had written it to no one in particular and to whoever was meant to find it. He wrote that he had outlived his family and had no children and no one to leave these things to through the ordinary channels. He wrote that he had put his important papers in the ground because he trusted the ground more than he trusted banks or lawyers or the people who administered the affairs of dead men for a percentage of the estate. He wrote that the parcels of land described in the deeds were his and had always been his, and that the deeds were legitimate and recorded at the county courthouse, and that whoever found them should know they had found something real. He wrote one more thing at the end of the letter, in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the rest, as if he had added it at a different time. He wrote, "I have watched this house for many years and I know the kind of people it chooses. If you are reading this, the house chose you." Margaret read the letter twice. Then she sat very still at the kitchen table for a long time. Outside the window, the garden was doing what late September gardens do in Tennessee, releasing the last of the summer and preparing for the long quiet of winter. The oak in the corner stood as it always stood, unhurried and permanent. She called Ruth Paxton next door and asked if Ruth happened to know anything about Howard Delacroix. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come over for supper. I'll tell you what I know." Ruth Paxton had been born in Hardin Falls in 1944 and had lived within 6 blocks of the same spot her entire life. There were not many people left in the town who could say this. Ruth was one of them. Her memory for the history of the place was the kind of memory that develops in people who have paid close attention to the same landscape for 8 decades. Not a perfect memory, not a documented one, but a layered one, built from conversations overheard and stories repeated, and the particular knowledge of a woman who had been present in the same community for longer than most of the buildings had been standing. Howard Delacroix, Ruth said over her kitchen table with 2 cups of tea between them, had been a complicated man. Quiet, private, the kind of man who was known in town without being known by anyone in town. He had come to Hardin Falls in 1921 from somewhere further south. No one was entirely certain where, and had bought the house on Clover Street and the land outside town with money that no one in Hardin Falls had ever fully accounted for. This was noted at the time, Ruth said, because 1921 was not a year when men arrived in small Tennessee towns with money and no explanation and were not talked about. He had worked the land for some years, had been seen in town occasionally, at the hardware store, at the feed merchant, had never married, had never, to anyone's knowledge, had a visitor who stayed more than a night. When he stopped being seen in town regularly in the 1950s, it was assumed that age had slowed him. When he died in 1961, his affairs had apparently been settled quietly, without a visible estate process, in the way that the affairs of solitary men sometimes were in small towns where people knew each other well enough to handle things informally. The land, Ruth said, was a different matter. She leaned forward. The land, she said, had been talked about for years. Parcels out past the Millbrook Road and up toward the ridge. People had wondered about them over the decades, who owned them, why nothing had been done with them. There had been some development interest in the 90s when the county was growing and people were looking at land north of town. But the ownership had always been unclear. The county records, as best Ruth understood it, had shown the parcels in Delacroix's name without any recorded transfer. Margaret looked at the deeds on Ruth's kitchen table between their teacups. Then she looked at Ruth. "Is that land still there?" she asked. Ruth smiled. "As far as I know," she said, "nobody's moved it." Patricia Oakes was not a woman who expressed surprise easily. 30 years of handling the legal complications of a small town's worth of human beings had given her a face that received information with the same measured attention, regardless of what the information was. Margaret had noticed this on her first visit and had appreciated it, because what she needed from an attorney was not reaction but analysis. She set the deeds on Patricia's desk on a Monday morning, 3 days after she found them. Patricia read each one without speaking. She read the letter from Howard Delacroix. She sat back in her chair. "These are recorded deeds," Patricia said. "I can verify that this afternoon. If they're in the county record and there's no recorded transfer out of Delacroix's name, then the question of who owns this land is genuinely open." "What does open mean?" Margaret asked. "It means," Patricia said, measuring her words with the care of someone who does not want to create expectations she cannot guarantee, "that you found these documents on property you have been living on for 31 years, in a house you have maintained and contributed to for 31 years, and that you may have a claim that is worth examining very carefully." She paused. "It also means I need to do some research before I tell you anything more specific than that. Can you leave these with me?" Margaret had made copies at the library the previous day. She left the originals with Patricia and drove home through the October streets of Hardin Falls, past the hardware store and the diner and the post office and the Methodist church, and she thought about Howard Delacroix putting 4 property deeds in an oilcloth in a metal box and burying them under what would eventually become her tomato garden in 1959. And she thought about what it means when the ground beneath you turns out to have been holding something all along. It took Patricia 3 weeks. She verified the deeds at the county courthouse. All 4 were recorded in the name of Howard James Delacroix with no recorded transfer. She commissioned a title search for each parcel, working through a title company in Nashville, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that this was not the kind of matter that benefited from shortcuts. She spoke with a property attorney in Millbrook County about the parcels that crossed the county line. She consulted with an estate law specialist about the question of unclaimed property from a deceased owner with no known heirs. She called Margaret on a Thursday morning in late October. The title searches, she said, had confirmed what the county records showed. All 4 parcels remained in Howard Delacroix's name. There had been no recorded transfers, no tax sales, no adverse possession claims that had been formally adjudicated. The parcels had been quietly paying minimal property taxes through an automatic account that appeared to have been set up by Delacroix himself before his death, and that had been drawing from a small trust at a Nashville bank that neither the bank nor the county had apparently felt motivated to resolve. The trust, Patricia said carefully, named no beneficiary by name. It named instead the occupant of the property at 14 Clover Street, Hardin Falls, Tennessee, as the party authorized to direct the management of the parcels. Patricia paused. "That is you," she said. "That has been you for 31 years. Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table when Patricia told her this. The same table where she had read the bank statement 6 weeks earlier. The same window. The same garden outside it, bare now, in late October, the oak unmoved as always. "What is the land worth?" Margaret asked. Patricia had spoken with an appraiser. 2 of the 4 parcels were of modest value, rural acreage with limited development potential. The third was more substantial, a 40-acre parcel, along the Millbrook Road that had been the subject of development interest in the past, and whose value had only increased as the town had grown toward it. The fourth parcel, the one up toward the ridge, had something on it that the appraiser had flagged and that Patricia had then investigated separately. There was a natural spring on the ridge parcel, a significant one, the kind that had become considerably more valuable in the past 2 decades, as water rights had become an increasingly serious matter in the region. There was a company, Patricia said, a regional water management company out of Nashville, that had been trying for 6 years to identify and acquire land with access to natural water sources in this county. She had, she said, taken the liberty of making an inquiry. The company was very interested. Margaret listened to the numbers Patricia gave her. They were not numbers she had a framework for. She had spent her life working with the scale of numbers that a hospital administrator and a county official, a small Tennessee town, work with. These were different numbers. She asked Patricia to repeat them. Patricia repeated them. Margaret looked out the window at the garden, where she had pulled tomato plants on a September morning and hit something metal in the ground. Gerald's attorney contacted Patricia in November to discuss the divorce settlement. The conversation that Patricia described to Margaret afterward had the quality of a negotiation conducted by one party who understood the terrain, and one party who did not yet know how much the terrain had changed. Gerald's position, as his attorney presented it, was straightforward. The house was his. The transferred funds were his by right as a joint account holder. He was prepared to offer Margaret a monthly payment from the funds as a gesture of good faith, an amount that his attorney presented as generous, and that Margaret, when Patricia told her the figure, recognized as approximately what she would need to cover groceries and utilities. Patricia had listened to the offer. Then she had explained certain things. The divorce proceedings would address the question of the account transfer and the court's view of assets accumulated during a 43-year marriage. This would take time, and the outcome would depend on a number of factors. She was prepared to proceed on that basis if Gerald's attorney wished. She had also mentioned, at the appropriate moment, that her client had recently come into possession of documentation establishing her authority over a collection of land parcels in Hardin and Millbrook counties, including a ridge parcel, with a significant natural spring in which a Nashville company had expressed substantial acquisition interest. There was a pause on the other end of the telephone, Patricia told Margaret, that contained a significant renegotiation of someone's understanding of the situation. Gerald called Margaret directly 2 days later. She had not spoken to him since the morning of September 14th. His voice on the phone had the particular quality of a man who has been told something by his attorney and has been thinking about it since, and has not yet found a comfortable way to approach the conversation. He said he had heard about the land. He said he wanted to talk. He said he thought they could work things out reasonably. He said he had always respected her and that this did not have to be difficult. Margaret listened to all of it. Then she said, "Gerald, you emptied our account on the morning you left. You took 43 years of what we built together and you put it in a car and drove south. I sat at this kitchen table and looked at $0 on a screen. I want you to remember that number when your attorney calls Patricia tomorrow." She ended the call. She sat for a moment. Then she made herself a cup of tea. The settlement was reached in February, 4 months after the papers were filed. Patricia negotiated with the precision of someone who had spent 3 decades understanding exactly what leverage looked like and how to use it without waste. The transferred funds were addressed. The house, which Gerald had been so certain about, became considerably less certain once a court considered 4 decades of a woman's contributions to a shared life. The land parcels, which were Margaret's through the Delacroix Trust, and had no connection to the marital estate, remained entirely hers. The acquisition agreement with the Nashville Water Company was signed in March. Margaret sat at Patricia's conference table and signed her name on the designated lines with the same steady hand she had used to sign 31 years of hospital administrative documents and the number that transferred into her personal account 2 weeks later was a number she had not possessed a framework for in October and that she had built one for in the months since. She paid off the house on Clover Street. This was the first thing she did, not because it was the financially optimal decision. Patricia had opinions about that, but because the house had been held over her as a fact for 6 months, a fact that belonged to someone else, and she wanted it to be a fact that belonged to her. She paid it off in full and held the deed in her hands, and thought about Dorothy Sims and Howard Delacroix, and the particular way that a house accumulates the lives of the people who have moved through it. The second thing she did was call Ruth Paxton and invite her to dinner. She cooked the meal herself at the kitchen table with the window that looked out on the garden, and they ate together and talked about Howard Delacroix and what he had known about the house he was leaving and the person he was leaving it for. Ruth said she believed that some people understood things about the future that they could not explain, and that Howard Delacroix had been, from everything she had ever heard about him, that kind of person. Margaret said she was not certain she believed in that kind of knowing. Ruth said she had not believed in it either, at her age. She paused. She said, and yet here we are. Margaret looked around her kitchen, at the table where she had made her list of 6 things in September, at the window where she had looked at the garden every day for 31 years, at the notepad with the small yellow flowers on the cover still sitting by the phone. Here we are, she agreed. Margaret Fowler was 74 years old when her husband left and 75 when the settlement was signed and the acquisition agreement completed, and the shape of her remaining life became something she was designing rather than something she was maintaining. She had not expected, at this age, to be designing anything. She had expected to be maintaining. Maintaining what she and Gerald had built. Maintaining the house, the garden, the routines of a long and settled life. She had been good at maintaining. Designing was different. Designing required looking at what she actually wanted, not what had been agreed upon or what was expected or what fit neatly into the shape of the life she had been living. She had not done that kind of looking in a long time. She found it harder than she expected and more interesting than she expected. And she was glad, as the months passed, that circumstances had required it of her. She established a small foundation. This was Ruth's idea, offered one evening in the spring when they were sitting on the back porch, watching the garden come back after winter. Ruth said that Margaret had more money now than one person needed at this stage of life, and that money at that scale required intention, or it became a problem rather than a resource. Ruth said this with the directness of a 79-year-old woman who had earned the right to say what she meant. The foundation's focus was housing assistance for women over 60 in Hardin County who were navigating sudden financial disruption. Margaret named it with the deliberateness she brought to things that mattered. She called it the Clover Street Foundation, after the address where she had learned that the ground beneath a life can hold more than you knew to look for. The first woman the foundation assisted was a 71-year-old named Frances, who lived on the other side of Hardin Falls, and whose situation was different from Margaret's in its details and identical in its essential shape. Margaret sat with Frances at Frances's kitchen table and did not tell her that everything would be fine, because Margaret had been told that by well-meaning people in September and had known it was not a thing anyone could promise. She told Frances what she knew for certain and what she did not know yet, and what could be done about the things she did not know yet. She helped her make a list. The garden on Clover Street came back in April, with the particular persistence of things that have been tended for 30 years and know how to return. The rose bushes Margaret had propagated from cuttings filled in along the fence. The bed where she had been clearing tomato plants the morning the trowel struck us metal was replanted with the deliberate intention of someone who now understood what the ground was capable of holding. She planted it with care. She watered it in the evenings. She watched it from the kitchen window the way she had watched every garden she had ever tended. The oak in the corner stood as it always stood. It had been there before Howard Delacroix. It had been there before the house. It would be there after everything else that was currently happening had become history. Margaret had always found this comforting in a way she could not entirely explain. The permanence of things that did not need her attention to continue. She did not think about Gerald more than she had to. She had made that decision consciously, early, the way she made most decisions, by identifying what she could control and directing her attention there. She could not control what Gerald had done, or where he was, or what he and Carol were building in whatever city they had gone to. She could control what she planted, and what she built, and who she helped, and how she moved through the days of the life that remained to her. She found, as the year went on, that the days were fuller than they had been in some time. On a Saturday morning in October, exactly 1 year after she had found the metal box in the garden, Margaret went out to the backyard with her trowel and her gardening gloves and the particular purposefulness of a woman who knows what her hands are for. The October light in Tennessee comes in at an angle that makes everything look considered, intentional, lit by someone who understood what they were doing. The roses had finished for the season. The tomatoes were done. The oak had begun to turn, the leaves going from green to the deep gold of old things that have earned their color. Margaret knelt at the edge of the bed and turned the soil for winter and thought about Howard Delacroix, who had buried 4 property deeds and a letter in this ground 64 years ago, and had trusted that the right person would find them at the right time. She did not know what he had known or how he had known it. She did not know if knowing was even the right word for what he had done. But she thought about the last line of his letter, written in the slightly unsteady hand of a man at the end of his life who was trying to say one more true thing before he was finished. The house chose you. She worked until noon. Then she went inside and washed her hands at the kitchen sink and put the kettle on and looked out the window at what she had tended and what she was still tending and what she intended to keep tending for as long as the ground would have her. She made her tea. She sat at her table. She was home. If you have ever had the floor give way beneath a life you believed was solid, if you have ever been handed less than you were owed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, if you have ever knelt in a garden just to move your body while your mind worked through the impossible, then Margaret's story belongs to you, because she did not find treasure in that backyard. She found proof that the years she had spent tending things, the garden, the house, the life, had not been without witness. That the ground remembered even when the people forgot. That what was taken from her in September could not take what the ground had been holding since before she arrived. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the things buried deepest are sometimes the things meant for you. That starting over at 74 is not the same as starting from nothing. That the house you have tended knows your name even when everyone else has forgotten it. We are grateful you walked this road with us today. We will see you in the next story.